It's time for us to check back in with Dale in Watermelon Hill and see what happens next. If you've missed any of the previous readings, just look in the description below for a playlist. And if you'd like to buy this wonderful book, please visit watermelonhillbook.com. I'll put that link in the description below too. Bed, Path, and Beyond. We never had a bathroom the entire time we lived on the farm. In the earlier years, Dad couldn't afford it, but even after he could, we still did not have a bathroom. It got close, but never quite made it. Dad partitioned off a section of the back porch for that purpose, and Curtis offered to buy the fixtures and install them, but that was as far as it got. From that time on, we called it the bathroom, but it was just used for a junk storage room. Dad wanted to go out on the back porch and enter the bathroom from there, but Mom wanted an entrance from inside the house. They could never come to an agreement about the entrance or how they would rearrange the furniture inside the house to make room for another door, so they never did it. Did I mention that Mom and Dad were stubborn? They had lived without a bathroom for so long, I don't think it was a high priority with them, but with or without a bathroom, certain necessary things still had to be taken care of. We had no showers or even tub baths. We simply had sponge baths with pans of water and washcloths. As much as I reminisce about the good old days, I must admit that I have no desire to go back to that. I enjoy showers too much. About 50 yards from the back door and slightly downhill was the outhouse. Some had a single seat, but we had a two-holer, as outhouses with two seats were called. They were not toilet seats, but just holes in the wooden planking of the seating surface, sandpapered to remove splinters. There was a pit underneath to catch the waste, which composted naturally. In later years, we sprinkled it with lime, but it never exactly smelled like roses. You may ask why we had two seats. But if a child fell in, the parent sure wouldn't want to clean them up afterwards, so they usually went with them. If it was at night, even the adult girls felt more at ease if they went out in the dark together. There was no lighting, so they had to take a flashlight. There were all sorts of night sounds, so female visitors from the city especially wanted company when they went out. In later years, after I had moved away from home, Dad, along with Curtis's family, built another outhouse closer to the house. This one had 3 holes, was plastered inside, and had electric lights. With the new and modern outhouse, we also had toilet paper, but not in the good old days. We used whatever we had, but the toilet paper of choice was the Sears and Roebuck catalog. Every family, even in the country, had one. It was compact and was big enough to last a long time. A plus was that we had ready reading material on hand until we used it. The older catalogs were printed on porous paper like newsprint, so they were far superior to later editions with glossy color pictures in them. I'm not sure, but I think that was when we switched over to regular toilet paper. At night, when nature called, we had the choice of going to the outhouse or using the chamber pot, or as we called it, the slop jar. It was an enameled metal pot about a foot high by 10 inches in diameter with a lid. The pot was kept under the bed until needed. The worst part was having to empty and clean it in the morning. I would have much rather gone to the outhouse. If all I needed to do was a number 1, I usually didn't go any farther than the edge of the yard, but the girls always went to the outhouse. A trip to the little house out back in the winter was quite an experience to the uninitiated. With the temperature hovering near 0, wind whipping up through the holes, and frost on the seat, you sure didn't want to spend any more time there than necessary. Sometimes you would even stick to the seat if you sat still for too long. If we were out in the woods, as we often were, we had to make do with what was at hand. We hardly ever took paper with us, so leaves were the best substitute. I preferred redbud leaves, but maple or sycamore were adequate, as they were all large leaves. Just be sure not to use poison oak or poison ivy, or you would have far worse problems than just being without a bathroom. When all the leaves were off the trees in the winter, it was more difficult, and I would be reduced to using a handful of dried grass. We seem to have made the full journey back to caveman status, but we really were not as uncivilized as it may seem. We just didn't have the convenience of a bathroom. I could go back to those days and survive, but I would much rather have a modern bath than a path. The barn. Our barn was old when we bought the farm and didn't improve much with time. It was even more ramshackle than the house, and in later years we could have sold it piece by piece as weathered barnwood to make crafts with and got more than it was worth as a whole. Still, I have a lot of good memories of playing there as a child and of the horses and cows back when we still farmed. The barn was composed of two structures with a sort of breezeway between them, covered by a tin roof which connected the two halves. One side contained two stalls, back to back, for Nell and Lady, our team of horses. The rest of that side was a large open space, 2 stories high, for hay storage. This was one of my favorite places to play. Since we didn't have a hay baler, the hay was piled in loose and I would make tunnels through it. Being a large open space with only one layer of boards for outer walls, there were 2 wooden poles spanning the space like rafters for support and a long metal rod bolted between the sides to keep them pulled together. One of my favorite things to do was to hand walk either the metal rod or the wooden poles across the hay. I would try to make it all the way across, but if I didn't, I would just drop into the hay with no harm done. On the walls in the breezeway or entryway were hung the horses' harness, collars, single trees, double trees, bridles, saddles, etc. There were always some bats hanging up high in the rafters of the entryway. They were very useful in catching insects around the barn. The other side contained 2 stalls, one large and one smaller one, with a separate small space for a calf so it could be separated from its mama when we milked the cow. In one corner of the large stall was a corn crib lined with metal lath mesh to keep out mice, or at least help. Nailed to the wall near the door from the entryway was a wooden ladder leading to the upstairs hay storage, which had large doors opening back into the entryway for ease of unloading hay from the wagon. Dad put an addition onto this half of the barn to use as a chicken house and feed storage. Here we kept barrels for the Midlands, which were mixed with water for the hogs, dairy feed for the cows, as well as a barrel of shelled corn for the chickens. I actually enjoyed shelling the corn. We had a hand-cranked corn sheller attached to a barrel into which we would feed an ear of corn. As we cranked it, the metal teeth would remove the corn from the cob and eject the cob. I thought it was fun instead of work. All of us kids had to try the animal feed to see what it tasted like. The Midlands didn't taste too bad, a little dry and powdery, but my personal favorite was the dairy feed. It was composed of ground grain mixed with molasses, and we would dig through it to find the little sweet lumps of molasses. These days I think about the mice and insects that were probably also eating it. As far as I know, none of us had any ill effects from it and never had to go see the vet. Under one side of the barn was an old cellar dug out of the hard dirt. We never used it, so the entrance was all grown up with weeds, and you would have to have been right on it to have any idea it was even there. We boys used it to play in sometimes as a cave. We would pretend it was a hideout, but once it was actually used for one. When I was about 9 or 10, an older cousin of mine from West Virginia came to stay with us for a while. He had run into a little trouble with the law back home and thought he'd better lie low for a while. I was glad to have some company, as the older brothers had left home already, but I had to be quiet about him being there and not tell anyone. Since we were on a dead-end road, we hardly ever had a visitor, and there was no through traffic at all, but whenever we did hear a car coming, my cousin hightailed it to the barn and hid in the old cellar. It was the perfect place to hide, with weeds and vines covering the entrance as they did. Once when my brother Lawrence was home, he, my brother Jack, and I were messing around in the barn one afternoon when it started raining. We were just killing time until the rain stopped, so we stretched out on the hay and took it easy. Have you ever listened to the sound of rain on a tin roof? There is nothing more soothing. Add to that the wonderful smell of the hay, and we all went sound asleep. When we woke up, the rain had stopped, and Mom was calling us to supper for about the 10th time. I don't know why. It wasn't really anything special, but for some reason that afternoon has always stuck in our memories. Test Patterns and Howdy Doody. The first television I ever saw was in a little country grocery store between Watermelon Hill and Louisa. I think it was about a 9-inch oval screen and mostly snow. But if Dad was going to the store for something, I tried to find an excuse to tag along. Snow and all, it was a drawing card. The store was always full, and some people actually bought something, though it was usually a token item so they could have an excuse to go watch the little TV. This was about 1950, and TV was still a new medium. Only the more well-to-do families owned one, and in our rural area there were only 2 stations, one in Charleston, West Virginia, and one in Huntington, West Virginia, broadcasting an average of 12 to 18 hours per day. Several years after we got our first television, another station was established in Charleston, but as long as I lived on Watermelon Hill, that was it. We had only 3 stations to choose from. No such thing as cable. You put up whatever antenna you could come up with and fiddled with it until a picture came in. Sometimes the antennas ended up with streamers of tinfoil or fingers bent in strange shapes. Whatever worked. I was shocked when Dad brought our first TV home in 1953. I was 12 and several of my friends already had TVs by that time, but I hadn't allowed myself to really hope for it, so I was surprised and delighted when we actually got one. It was a 17-inch black and white, of course, floor model Motorola, and was our TV until well after I came out of the Army in 1965. By the 70s, it had given way to a 19-inch table model, but was still serving as a table to set the new TV on. Jeff Foxworthy has a redneck joke about that. If you have a working TV sitting on top of a non-working TV, you might be a redneck. Well, we qualified, and I'm sure we made it in other categories as well. My brother Lawrence studied TV repair to make some after-hours money while he was finishing college, so every time something went wrong with the TV, Dad would insist on waiting until Lawrence came home the next time to fix it. The only problem was that Lawrence lived in Massachusetts, and it might be a few months to as much as a year before he came home again with no TV in the meantime. I had heard of television before I actually saw one, and I'm a little embarrassed to admit what I envisioned it to be like. I had heard that there was an invention that could transmit pictures through the air and they could be received in your home. Some people around the countryside near Louisa and Watermelon Hill didn't believe it at all, while others speculated that they would be able to see visions flying through the air as they were being transmitted. I didn't subscribe to that theory, but my ideals were just as ridiculous. I knew I couldn't hear radio transmissions as they went through the air, so I deduced that you wouldn't see the pictures as they were being transmitted either. What I did visualize was still related to the radio. I believed there would be a picture, but I assumed that the radio would somehow be modified to receive them. I couldn't conceive of having to have an entirely new machine. Continuing with this train of thought, I tried to imagine where the picture would be on our radio. The wooden cabinet took up almost all of the space, so the only place I could think of was where the tuning dial was. This space was so tiny that I thought, wow, you would have to be really close to see anything on that. I thought the same radio shows would be on, but we would see them on the tiny space of the radio dial. I didn't hold out a lot of hope for the survival of television if that was all you were going to be able to see. When we got our television, I was instantly addicted to it. Our 2 channels went off the air at midnight and didn't come back on until sometime the next morning, but I could tell you what show was on either channel at any hour of any day of the week. I hate the wrestling shows now, but we watched them on Saturday nights back then. We probably didn't realize that they were fake, but at the time it wouldn't have mattered anyway. If it was on TV, we watched it. That was when a big, long-haired, blonde wrestler named Gorgeous George was popular. On weekends, when the shows didn't start until later, I would sometimes turn the set on and watch the test pattern until the broadcasting began. It just occurred to me that younger people today probably don't have any idea what a test pattern is. It looked sort of like a target with concentric circles and lines extending out from the center, where there was the head of an Indian in a headdress. It was to show that you were indeed receiving a signal and to give you an opportunity to adjust the picture before the shows came on. The sets didn't stay in adjustment like they do now, so I was constantly fiddling with the horizontal and vertical size and hold. Don't misunderstand now, there was plenty of chores around the farm for me to do, and I could only watch television in my spare time, but I watched as much as possible. Those were the days of variety shows when Milton Berle was king of the air with the Texaco Theater. There was the Ed Sullivan Show, where I saw Elvis make his debut, and later on the Beatles. There were Sid Caesar and Imogene Coco, Eddie Cantor, Red Skelton, Jonathan Winters, Abbott and Costello doing their famous Who's on First routine on live television, Jimmy Durant, Goodnight Mrs. Calabash, Wherever You Are. One of my favorites was Jack Benny and his butler chauffeur, Rochester, driving his old Maxwell. Everyone made jokes about how tight Jack Benny was, and my favorite shows were where he made trips down to his vault to get some money. His security was better than Fort Knox. After going through many locked doors, down 2 lower levels, bypassing booby traps, and negotiating alligator-filled moats, he finally reached the very bottom level where his vault was located. The final guard was an old man who had not seen the light of day for years and didn't even know what year it was. It was great comedy. Those were the beginning years of the sitcom. Some shows like Amos and Andy carried over from radio, but there were several new ones. Ozzie and Harriet, Father Knows Best, and Leave It to Beaver were some of the more popular ones, but some that I liked were not so well known. 2 starred Wally Cox, Mr. Peepers and the Adventures of Hiram Holiday. The latter starred Wally as an unlikely hero, wielding an umbrella to fend off the bad guys. There were plenty of early Western movies with good guys in white hats and bad guys in black, except Lash LaRue, who was a good guy but always wore black. Most of the heroes had a comical sidekick. Roy Rogers had Gabby Hayes and Gene Autry had Pat Buttram. There was Wild Bill Hickok and his sidekick Jingles, Andy Devine, the Cisco Kid and Poncho. There was also the Lone Ranger and Tonto, Hopalong Cassidy and California, and several more. There was always the inevitable barroom brawl and the chase scene at the end where the hero usually tackled the bad guy off his horse and saved the day. The favorite after-school show was, of course, Howdy Doody. Buffalo Bob Smith, Clarabelle the Clown, and the Peanut Gallery are American icons. Even when the Happy Days show was on many years later, Richie Cunningham, Ron Howard, was jokingly referred to in several episodes as Howdy Doody because of his red hair. When the Mickey Mouse Club came on, it was a very strong rival, and it was my favorite. There was different formats each day in between the Mouseketeers songs and skits, sometimes cartoons, sometimes stories. Being a young boy, I thought the adventures of Spin and Marty were the best. They were always solving some kind of mystery in a cave or on a ranch or someplace exciting. Of course, I watched the Mouseketeers too and discussed the growth of Annette's bust with the other boys at school. A few years later came my all-time favorite after-school show, Rocky and Bullwinkle. It was a cartoon, but the humor was quite sophisticated. It really went over the heads of most young kids, but they still liked it because of the antics of the funny cartoon characters. You needed a little more maturity to appreciate the intricacies of the plays on words and subtle humor used in the show, such as the bad guys, Natasha, No Good Nick, and Boris, Bad Enough, 2 obviously Russian spies, and Bullwinkle's college, What's the Matter, You? It is still on late at night on a cartoon channel, and I still occasionally watch it. As I became a teenager, my interests included American Bandstand with the young Dick Clark. There were lots of shows that lasted for years and others that were a flash in the pan. The Gary Moore Show was where a young Carol Burnett got her start. Queen for a Day was very popular with the ladies who could dream that they could escape their 50s household drudgery for a day and really be treated like a queen. The Millionaire was a show where a rich man anonymously gave $1 million tax-free to a stranger each week. One of my favorite early 50s shows was Boston Blackie. He was a private detective who always drove around in a cool sports car of some kind. A favorite kiddie show in the 50s was Kukla, Fran, and Ollie. They were hand puppets, one a little lamb named Lamb Chop. They were sort of the predecessors of the Muppets, but much less sophisticated. The most notable ventriloquist show was Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy, the dummy. My favorite character on the show was another dummy, Mortimer Snerd. He was a dumb hillbilly, but he always seemed to get the best of the smarter guys. Maybe I identified with him. There was also Paul Winchell and Jerry Mahoney, the dummy, along with his dog Farfel, also a dummy. I saw my first color television in a store window in Louisa while a World Series baseball game was being played. The green of the grass really brought it to life. I thought it was great, and I wouldn't want to go back to all black and white. But in a way, it was also the end of television's infancy and innocence. Just as most shows did not survive the transition from radio to television, some did not survive switching to color. Even the Andy Griffith Show was never as good in color as it was in black and white. I sometimes watch the reruns in black and white, but seldom watch one in color. Of course, Barney Fife, Don Knotts, was gone from the show by then. I first saw Don Knotts in the mid-50s on a daytime soap. Not a comedy role, as he later was famous for, but a serious part as a retarded man. I still enjoy television and some of the recent shows, but I also spend a lot of time on the movie classics channels, watching some of the older movies, many of which are in black and white. As a rule, I don't like colorized versions of old movies. Great old movies like Sergeant York and The Grapes of Wrath just wouldn't be as good in color. In old horror classics like Frankenstein, black and white convey a sense of gloom and dread to the story and actually enhance it. Even the comparatively recent Young Frankenstein, even though it was a comedy, was shot in black and white, and much more recently and much more notable, Schindler's List. Mom liked the soaps and watched them when she could find time when we first got our TV. But after all of her children grew up and moved away from home, she had plenty of time to watch whatever she wanted. The one person I would have voted least likely to get hooked on soaps was my dad. He thought they were foolishness and not worth wasting anyone's time on. After Dad finally retired, when he was well into his 70s, he spent a lot more time around the house and enjoyed some of the game shows, such as To Tell the Truth and What's My Line, but still expressed his disdain of the soaps. When I would be home for a visit, I started noticing that when it was near time for Mom's favorite soap and the television was not on, Dad would say something like, "Old lady, isn't it about time for your story?" She would glance at the clock and turn the set on, and Dad would find some pretense to hang around the room while it was still on. Sometimes he would make a comment about a character or event in the show so that I knew he was paying attention and had been following the story for some time. He would never, if his life had depended on it, have admitted that he liked the soaps or even turned the set on, but he was hooked just the same. I never needled him about it, but I thought it was hilarious. Now we have high-definition television, thin screens you can hang on the wall, and huge screens with theater-quality sound. I wonder what the next great advance will be. Maybe virtual reality, interactive television. Whatever it is, it could not be more exciting than our first 17-inch black and white was to us. We'll stop right there for today. Funny, kind of humorous there, ending on the finding out his daddy actually had been watching the soaps, even he wouldn't admit it. We always, and Dale mentioned that, we always called them the stories. We didn't say the soaps, we'd say the stories. The stories are on, or you watch the story, or talking maybe about a lady who her story's on. She's got to watch her story. She's got to be home by 2 o'clock because her story's coming on. So that was a phrase that we used instead of soaps. I liked the very beginning part where Dale talked about how they almost got a bathroom. They got it, but it never got built completely. Sounds so much like something that would have happened to Pap and Granny at their house, or even with me and Matt. And I like that they always called it the bathroom, even though it wasn't the bathroom. We have 3 bedrooms in our house, and when Corey and Katie were really small, they shared one, 2 babies. The cribs was their nursery, and then that become their room. And after they outgrew their cribs and their little toddler beds, Matt built bunk beds for them, and that's where they were at until Corey was, I think, 16, when she finally decided she wanted to be in a different room. They wanted to separate. Now, there have been lots of times they said they wanted to separate, and I'd always say, okay, you sleep in the other room, and you prove to me you can sleep in there by yourself, and you can have that room. It'd be when they got in a fight or something, and then they could never do that because they wanted to sleep with each other, Anyway, all those years we used that as a spare room, and we had different things in there. We had a bed, so if somebody come, like Miss Cindy, they'd have a place to stay, and had like a little office area and a bunch of junk, like kind of what Dale described. Well, Corey and Katie, when they were real little, we didn't want them in there because there was stuff they could get hurt on, so we just kept the door shut. Well, somehow we started telling them there was things in there that was dangerous. They couldn't go in there because there wasn't a lock on the door. We started calling it the dangerous room. So we would say, it's in the you're looking for something. It's in the dangerous room. So the danger was gone once Corey and Katie got big enough not to, know to bother stuff that might hurt them or not poke themselves with a pen or whatever it was. But I imagine Dale's family was like that too. Like, it's in the bathroom, even though that wasn't a bathroom. So it's kind of like us saying, it's in the dangerous room. And it is funny, after Corey moved out and got married, I somehow just immediately reverted to calling that the dangerous room again instead of Corey's room. So now I'm back to calling it the dangerous room. Also interesting was all the hygiene, all the toiletry things that Dale talked about. Really a great description, because in our minds we think we have this really clear picture of what it would have been like. Of course, some of you may have lived it like Dale did, but you think about, you always see people taking the bath. Of course, they didn't take showers and baths like we do today because it was hard. They had to carry the water and all that. But you do picture them all taking a bath in a tub, like you see on Little House on the Prairie or on the old westerns or whatever. So you think, well, they did that all the time. And several years ago, a lady told me kind of the same thing that Dale did, that no, really, they just didn't take baths. You just didn't take a bath. You washed off with a washcloth, and that was pretty much it. Maybe in the summertime, if you were lucky enough to live by a creek or a river or something like that, you could bathe that way. But it just took so much effort to get a big wash tub of water and heat it up and do all that most of the time people didn't do that. They just washed off. So it's interesting that Dale touches on that. And then, of course, all the outhouse stuff. Now, I can remember one time when I had to use an outhouse that was still in use. I'd went with Pap to a little store over in Martins Creek, and I had to go to the bathroom, and I kept begging. He was talking, and I kept begging to go home, and he finally made me use that outhouse, and I sure wished I'd kept my mouth shut and not had to use it, because it was, like he was saying, there was bugs and spider webs and creepy stuff in there, but I did use it. So I'm so thankful. So many of the things that I love in the old days, like what Dale's, kind of like what he's saying, I love those old, the way the family pulled together to be self-sufficient, and the camaraderie they had and the closeness like Dale talks about with his family. But I am thankful for my modern day plumbing, for sure, and that I can take a shower every day. I can take a bath anytime I want to. So Dale kind of ends that part saying, we sound like we're the cavemen. And not really, because I think that was probably average. But it reminded me though of another book that we've read, as I've been reading to you, was the Alex Stewart book. Now, if you remember, there was people that lived near Alex Stewart that didn't even have an outhouse, and they used the bathroom outside, and they were not good about using it in different places, and it caused disease and all these sicknesses and all that. So my goodness, Dale's family was like, if you know what we'd say today, living high on the hog or something. They definitely were, because they knew to take care of themselves, and they had the outhouse and had all that took care of. just interesting to think about those differences. The people that Alex described were so pitiful, and they would have been older. It would have been a different time. It would have been much further back in time than what Dale was talking about, but still, even with Dale saying they were kind of like the cavemen, they weren't. That was just normal, and sounds like they made it just fine. Obviously they did, if his mother and father never could agree on it enough to have their own indoor bathroom, so they were obviously making it just fine. It did remind me though of that Dale talking about the different leaves that you could use or not use if you were in the woods. But I've heard that my whole life. Maybe somebody says, the power was off, or the plumbing was tore up, or just if you just have one bathroom, somebody's in the bathroom and you got to go, and they'd say, I had to hit the woods. So that reminded me of Dale talking about the leaves. I really loved the description of him and his brothers there in the barn with the rain. Oh my, you can just almost hear it and see the hay and see them all there, taking so relaxed that they all went to sleep. And such a beautiful memory. I can see why it stuck in Dale's mind. Reminds me of a time years ago, me and Corey and Katie and Matt and some dear friends were over in Cataloochee. We've been over there to sing, Corey and Katie, to sing at a church. We filmed them singing at a church. This is long before YouTube, before we were doing Celebrating Appalachia. We carried guitars way back in there. Corey's guitar was just the one guitar. It was before Katie was playing the fiddle. Anyway, but after we'd finished all that and we come out, we were going to look at some of the historic houses there, and there's a barn, and we were in the barn looking around, and it come up a storm, like a summertime storm with a heavy rain, but we were inside that barn, and we were on the top level, and we sat there, and you could see out across this beautiful, beautiful area, but you could see the rain. And I just remember how we were together with friends, and we knew the rain wouldn't last long. It's very typical for those kind of really hard, fierce kind of storms to come and be gone in the mountains of Appalachia in the summertime. But just that camaraderie and the feeling of we were glad we were inside that barn, not walking where we had been walking back in there to the church because the gate was shut. We had to walk a long ways. So it's a nice memory. I have some pictures of that day too, but that was nice being inside there. And of course you couldn't help but think, being in a historic place, I couldn't help but wonder back in the day, like what Dale's memory, maybe there was somebody was, the barn went with the house there that's across the road. It might be the Caldwell house, I might be wrong about that. But, it makes you think who else in years gone by had been in here when it rained like this, except it was not a park that people visited then, it was their home. So I love that memory of Dale's that he shared. It's interesting, all the talk about the TVs. I remember, of course, there was always a TV in my life. I'm a different generation than Dale, but I do remember those great old big TVs. They were always big, the ones Granny and Pap had, big consoles that sat there, and you could decorate, you could put your picture frames and stuff on top of the TV. And I had totally forgotten about, till Dale mentioned it, about the screen not being stable so that it would roll. We had one TV one time. For a long time, it was really bad, and I can't remember if Pap fixed it or it got somebody to fix it, or if we used to take our TVs to Rogers Electric. If they fixed it, or if we just got a new TV, but it would just, the picture would just roll, and you'd have to fiddle with that and try to get it to stop rolling, and then it would start again, and you'd have to get it to stop rolling. So I had totally forgot about that. And like Dale, when I was growing up, we barely got, if you were lucky, you got 3 channels. Most of the time you just got 2 channels. And the antenna, the same thing. People yelling, turn it this way, turn it that way. I can remember we had it on top of the hill behind Granny and Pap's house, and then at one time we had it in front. We must have changed, thinking that would be better. So lots of things, so many things have changed between Dale and my childhood, but even, of course, between now and today. But you think about those great old big TVs that he was talking about and I was talking about. Now, the first ones he had was little, and then they got bigger, but the ones I remember was the big ones, like from the 70s. And then Dale's vision of when he tried to think about what TV would be, how he thought it was going to be on that little dial. And, then he kind of felt silly when he actually seen the TV. But then think about what most people watch stuff on today. Whoops, I dropped something. But see, it's your phone. Look how little. I mean, It's the phone. It's this small screen compared to that great old big one in Pap and Granny's house. I can tell by analytics, people that watch videos, you can tell it's kind of aggregates the information for you. Lots of people watch my videos on their phone. I watch videos on my phone, so I understand why they do it. It's convenient. It's always with you. But again, you're watching it on a little screen when you could go inside and watch it on a big screen. So that's really interesting that it's thinking about how the course of TV, and of course, like he said, it makes you wonder what's coming next. I loved all the old shows that he mentioned. I'm not familiar with any of them. I mean, some of them I've heard of, the most famous ones that he talked about. Some of them, of course, the Ed Sullivan Show and Father's Knows Best and all those, but I've never really watched any of them. But it made me think of the ones from my childhood, of course, that were popular. And Granny, when I stay with Granny, she watches Westerns, so that's always great. She's got it on the Western Channel, so I love to watch those old Westerns. But I was down there the other day, and I was kind of doing some work, and then my brother Steve come, and Granny had laid down. She wasn't feeling well, and me and Steve was just sitting there watching. We were mostly talking, but the TV was on. But A-Team come on, and so we watched 1 or 2 episodes of A-Team. Wasn't really watching them. We were talking, but it was on, and I was kind of halfway paying attention to it. But that really took me back to the days I'd forgot all about. I remember the show, but it'd been so long since I watched it, and watching how they all interacted together. And that was one of Paul's favorite shows when he was little. I was 4 years older than Paul. I was still little enough to enjoy it too, but he really liked it. And so he had the one year for his birthday or Christmas or something, Granny and Pap got him like the A-Team, the van they drove, and then he had a Mr. T doll, and I can't remember if he had Hannibal or Face or any of the others, but really took me back to that, and Murdoch, and I don't know. It's amazing to watch some of those shows now, though, and see the difference in them and today. Makes you wish you could go back, just like I know it does Dale. Makes you wish you could go back to those days. At the same time, being thankful for the wonderful things we have today, like indoor plumbing. So I hope you enjoyed this part of the book. Please leave a comment and tell me what jumped out at you and what parts you liked, and if you remember any of those old shows that Dale mentioned. And as always, I hope you drop back by next Friday, so we've got to see what happens next to Dale in Watermelon Hill. We're getting close. We've probably got about 2 more readings before this book's finished.